Welcome, gentle listeners, to Educational Bedtime. If this journey through history brings you the peace and knowledge you seek, consider subscribing to join us on more explorations through time. Tonight we invite you to settle back, close your eyes, and let your mind drift to a world both beautiful and brutal, elegant and unforgiving. Imagine, if you will, stepping through a doorway in time, leaving behind the comfort and freedom of your modern life, to find yourself on the bustling streets of Edo, Japan, in the year 1750. The cherry blossoms are in bloom, their delicate petals dancing on the spring breeze. Temple bells ring in the distance, their deep bronze voices carrying across wooden rooftops. The scene appears peaceful, almost magical, exactly as we've come to imagine old Japan from countless films and stories. But as you take your first breath of that ancient air, something feels wrong. The smell is overwhelming. Human waste, rotting fish, wood smoke, and something else. Fear. The people around you move with careful, measured steps, their eyes downcast, their shoulders bent not with age, but with the weight of absolute submission. You realize, with growing unease, that you've entered not a romantic fairy tale, but one of history's most controlled societies, where a single misstep could cost you everything. Over the next 2 hours, we'll walk together through 4 distinct worlds within this single moment in time. We'll experience the suffocating daily life of common people, who lived under rules so strict they governed how you could walk, what you could wear, and even how you were allowed to die. We'll follow the tragic story of Saigo Takamori, the last true samurai who chose death over dishonor, when his ancient world collided with modernity. We'll explore the mysterious truth behind the ninja, separating centuries of myth from the surprising reality of Japan's shadow warriors. And finally, we'll step inside the golden prison of the Shogun's palace, where ultimate power became the ultimate trap. But first, let us discover why you, with all your modern knowledge and resilience, would struggle to survive even a single day in this world of rigid beauty and hidden terror. Chapter 1: Why You'd Never Survive 24 Hours in Edo, Japan. The temple bell's deep bronze voice cuts through the pre-dawn darkness, and you jolt awake on a thin straw mattress that offers little comfort against the hard wooden floor beneath. Your back aches, your neck is stiff, and the air in the cramped room feels thick and stale. Through paper-thin walls you can hear your neighbors stirring. An entire family of 7 squeezed into a space no larger than a modern bathroom, their quiet movements accompanied by muffled coughs and the soft crying of a hungry infant. The smell of human bodies pressed too closely together mingles with the acrid smoke from cooking fires, and the ever-present odor of waste that defines life in the merchant quarter of Edo. You are a merchant in the great city of Edo, what we now call Tokyo, and according to the rigid social hierarchy that governs every aspect of life, you occupy the lowest rung of society below even the farmers who grow the rice that keeps the nation alive. The samurai look down upon you as a necessary evil, someone who profits from the labor of others without creating anything of true value. The government tolerates your existence because commerce keeps the wheels of society turning, but they make certain you never forget your place in the carefully constructed order that has governed Japan for 2 centuries. The darkness outside your single window is still complete, but the bell's message is clear. Tardiness is not merely discouraged, it is dangerous. In this world, being late to open your shop doesn't just mean lost profits. It means drawing unwanted attention from the neighborhood officials who report everything to the local magistrate. And in a society where collective responsibility means your neighbors suffer for your mistakes, tardiness becomes not just personal failure, but community betrayal that can result in punishment for entire blocks of families. The system of mutual surveillance, called the 5 family groups or gonyomi, ensures that everyone watches everyone else, and any deviation from expected behavior is reported immediately to the authorities. You rise quickly, your feet touching the cold wooden floor, and immediately you're reminded of one of the first rules you must never forget. You cannot simply walk as you would naturally walk. Your gait, your posture, the way you carry yourself, all of these must reflect your social status with mathematical precision. Walk too confidently, and you risk being accused of stepping above your station. Move too freely, and you might accidentally mirror the bearing of a samurai, a transgression that could be met with swift and brutal punishment. The very ground beneath your feet seems to judge your worthiness to walk upon it, and each step must be calculated to show the proper degree of submission and humility. As you dress in the dim light filtering through rice paper screens, your clothing choices are not matters of personal preference or weather, but legal requirements enforced with the full power of the state. The Tokugawa government has issued precise sumptuary laws that dictate exactly what people of your class may wear, when they may wear it, and even how they must wear it. Your kimono must be made of cotton or hemp silk, is forbidden to merchants, reserved for those of higher status who have earned the right to such luxury through birth rather than effort. The colors must be subdued, browns, greys, and dark blues that reflect your position in society. No bright reds, no brilliant yellows, no rich purples that might suggest you consider yourself equal to your betters. Even your hair must be styled in a manner appropriate to your station. The oil you use to dress it regulated by law. The ornaments you may wear specified by government decree. Every morning dressing becomes an act of legal compliance, a daily reminder that your body itself belongs not to you, but to the state that has decided your place in the great hierarchy of existence. The very fabric against your skin whispers of your inferiority. The rough texture of permitted cloth a constant reminder that comfort is a privilege you have not earned and will never be allowed to enjoy. The smell hits you as you step outside your dwelling, a mixture of human waste, wood smoke, and decay that never quite leaves the air in the merchant quarter. Edo is home to over 1 million people, making it one of the largest cities in the world. But it has no sewage system as we would recognize it today. Human waste is collected by night soil men who sell it to farmers outside the city. But the process is imperfect and overwhelmed by the sheer volume of waste produced by so many people living in such close quarters. The smell of human filth mingles with everything else. The smoke from countless cooking fires, the rotting scraps of food, and the musty odor of too many people living too closely together in spaces never designed for such density. The night soil collection system, while more organized than in many other cities of the world, cannot keep pace with the reality of 1 million people relieving themselves daily. The wooden buckets overflow, the collectors cannot reach every dwelling every day, and the waste accumulates in corners and alleyways where it attracts flies and breeds disease. The very air you breathe carries particles of decay and human waste, coating your lungs with the reality of urban life in a world without modern sanitation. Your nostrils burn with the constant assault of odors that would make a modern person retch, but you have learned to breathe through your mouth and find what small pockets of cleaner air exist in this urban maze. You make your way through narrow streets barely wide enough for 2 people to pass, the wooden buildings leaning inward as if bowing to each other in perpetual deference. The architecture itself reflects the society's values. No building may be taller than the local castle, and ostentatious display is not just discouraged but illegal, punishable by confiscation of property and exile from the city. Yet even in this uniformity, there is a strange beauty, the clean lines of wood and paper, the careful attention to proportion, the way morning mist clings to the curved rooftops like a gentle blessing. But beauty cannot mask the underlying reality of control and oppression that defines every aspect of existence in this carefully ordered world. The streets themselves tell the story of a society obsessed with hierarchy and classification. Each quarter is designated for specific social classes, and crossing boundaries requires permission and often payment of fees. The merchant quarter where you live is cramped and poorly drained, while the samurai quarters enjoy wider streets, better drainage, and more space between buildings. Even the very ground you walk on reminds you of your inferior status, as the quality of street maintenance reflects the importance of those who live there. Your feet splash through puddles of questionable liquid, while samurai districts feature carefully maintained stone paths that ensure their feet never touch common dirt. But beauty cannot mask hunger, and hunger is your constant companion, gnawing at your stomach with teeth sharper than any blade. As a merchant, you are taxed heavily and regulated strictly, your profits squeezed by government controls that ensure wealth flows upward to the samurai class. The price you may charge for your goods, the quantities you may sell, even the customers you may serve, all are controlled by guild regulations enforced with the full power of the state. The rice that forms the foundation of every meal is often beyond your means, leaving you to subsist on millet, barley, and whatever vegetables you can afford when they are available. The irony is bitter. You handle goods that travel from across Japan, beautiful crafts and precious materials that represent wealth beyond your comprehension. But you yourself live in poverty by design. The system ensures that wealth flows upward, to the samurai class, and ultimately to the shogun, while those who actually create and move goods survive on the margins of subsistence. Your hands touch silk and gold, precious metals and fine ceramics, but your own life is one of deliberate deprivation. carefully maintained to ensure you never forget your place in the social order. Meat is rarely seen on your table, not only because of Buddhist prohibition against taking life, but because it is simply too expensive for someone of your station. The government actively discourages meat consumption among the lower classes, seeing it as a luxury that might give commoners ideas above their station. Fish is available but expensive, and often what you can afford is nearly spoiled. The fresher catch is reserved for those who can pay premium prices. Your diet consists mainly of rice when you can afford it, vegetables when they are in season, and a thin soup made from whatever scraps you can obtain. The hunger is not just physical, but psychological. A constant reminder that your needs come last in a society that values you least. You watch wealthier merchants eat better food, samurai consume delicacies, and you know that your own children will grow up malnourished. Not because food doesn't exist, but because the social system demands that you remain hungry as proof of your inferior status. The very act of eating becomes a political statement, and every bite you take must be appropriate to your station in life. As you approach your small shop, you notice the familiar knot of anxiety forming in your stomach, the same tension that greets you every morning and follows you to sleep every night. Today, like every day, you must navigate an invisible minefield of social protocols and legal requirements that could explode at any moment. A samurai might enter your shop, and you must know exactly how to bow, how deeply, for how long, with what degree of sincerity and submission. Too shallow, and you show disrespect that could cost you your life. For every samurai carries the legal right of kurosute gomen, the right to cut down a commoner who shows insufficient respect without trial or consequence. Too deep, and you might be accused of mockery, of exaggerating your deference to highlight the samurai's need for such display. The angle of your bow must be calculated with mathematical precision. Your eyes must remain fixed on the ground for exactly the right amount of time, and your voice must carry the proper tone of reverence without crossing into sarcasm. Every muscle in your body must convey sincerity while your mind calculates the complex social mathematics that determine whether you live or die, based on the mood and whims of someone born into privilege. You've seen it happen, and the memory haunts your quiet moments like a recurring nightmare. 3 months ago, a fellow merchant in the next street made some small error in his greeting to a young samurai. Perhaps his bow was a fraction too shallow, or he raised his eyes a moment too soon, or his voice carried a note that could be interpreted as insufficiently respectful. The samurai's sword cleared its sheath in one fluid motion, and the merchant's life ended before he could even speak an apology, his blood pooling on the wooden floor of his own shop, while customers and family watched in horrified silence. The body was removed within the hour, the blood was cleaned from the street by the dead man's own family, and life continued as if nothing had happened. Because in the eyes of the law, nothing significant had happened. A samurai had exercised his legal right, and a commoner had paid the price for insufficient respect. The transaction as mundane and legally protected as buying rice in the market. The shop reopened the next day under new management. The dead merchant's family quietly disappeared to avoid the shame of association with someone who had died for disrespecting his betters. This is the reality you live with every moment. The knowledge that your life can end without warning, without trial, without appeal, simply because someone of higher status feels you have not shown adequate deference. It's a weight that presses down on your shoulders with every breath, making you constantly aware of your posture, your expression, your tone of voice, the position of your hands, and the angle of your head. Every interaction becomes a potential death sentence, and you must perform perfect submission while maintaining the dignity necessary to conduct business and feed your family. The morning progresses, and customers begin to appear, each one requiring a careful calculation of relative status and appropriate behavior. When a farmer enters your shop, you are slightly his superior in the official order, but you must be careful not to lord this over him. Farmers are considered more valuable than merchants because they produce food, and showing too much superiority to a farmer might be seen as questioning the wisdom of the social order itself. The interaction becomes a delicate dance of mutual respect, tinged with mutual resentment, as you both understand that you are trapped in a system that pits you against each other instead of against those who truly oppress you both. When an artisan visits, the calculations become even more complex, requiring mental gymnastics that exhaust you before the day has truly begun. Officially, artisans rank above merchants because they create useful objects with their hands rather than merely moving goods created by others. But the reality of who has money and who doesn't creates a subtle tension that must be navigated with the skill of a diplomat. You must show respect for his higher status while also maintaining the dignity necessary to conduct business, and he must acknowledge his need for your services while asserting his superiority in the social hierarchy. It's exhausting, this constant calculation of relative position and appropriate behavior, like playing an elaborate game where the rules change without notice, and the penalty for mistakes is death or social destruction. Your mind becomes a calculating machine, constantly processing social data and adjusting your behavior accordingly, leaving little mental energy for creativity, innovation, or the simple human pleasures that make life worth living. The heat of the day brings new challenges and new reminders of your precarious position in society. Your shop has no windows as we would recognize them, only sliding panels that can be opened or removed entirely, leaving you exposed to the eyes of every passerby. Privacy is a luxury you cannot afford, and every transaction takes place under the watchful eyes of neighbors and passers-by, who may report anything unusual to the authorities. This transparency is intentional. In a society built on collective responsibility and mutual surveillance, privacy is seen as an opportunity for subversion, a chance to engage in activities that might threaten the carefully maintained order. The afternoon heat also brings the smell of the nearby execution ground, where criminals meet their ends in public displays designed to reinforce social order and remind everyone of the consequences of stepping outside accepted boundaries. The scent of death mingles with the other odors of the city, a constant reminder of what happens to those who step too far outside the bounds of acceptable behavior or who displease someone with the power to destroy them. You've attended these executions. Attendance is often mandatory for merchants, part of your civic duty to witness justice being done and to see what happens to those who forget their place. The memories of those broken bodies, the casual efficiency with which life is ended, the festive atmosphere that surrounds these displays of state power, haunt your quieter moments and invade your dreams. The way the crowd cheers when the blade falls, the manner in which children are brought to watch and learn about the consequences of disobedience, the normalcy with which death is integrated into daily life. All of this creates a psychological atmosphere of constant fear that permeates every aspect of existence. You have seen men beheaded for stealing food, women executed for adultery, and entire families destroyed for harboring someone who violated sumptuary laws or spoke disrespectfully of the government. As evening approaches, you begin the careful process of closing your shop, securing your modest inventory, and preparing for the journey home through darkening streets that become more dangerous with each passing hour. But even this simple task is governed by regulations that specify exactly when shops must close, how goods must be stored, and what procedures must be followed to secure merchandise overnight. The goods must be stored in prescribed ways that allow for easy inspection by officials, and any deviation from the established procedures could bring investigation from local authorities, who have the power to confiscate your entire inventory on suspicion of illegal activity. The walk home takes you past the rice broker's establishment, where you're reminded daily of your dependence on a system designed to keep you perpetually vulnerable and at the mercy of forces beyond your control. The price of rice, the foundation of survival, is controlled by a complex network of brokers and officials who answer ultimately to the Shogun and his administrators. When harvests are poor, prices rise without limit, and people of your class simply go hungry watching their children grow thin, while rice sits in warehouses waiting for prices to reach levels that maximize profit for those who control the distribution system. There is no appeal, no alternative market, no escape from a system that can strangle you economically at any moment based on the whims of those in power or the natural fluctuations of weather and harvest. You pass groups of samurai moving through the streets with casual confidence, their two swords marking them as clearly as uniforms. Their easy laughter a reminder that for them, life is a game where the rules are written in their favor. They walk with the assurance of people who have never had to calculate the social implications of their posture, never had to worry that a misplaced word might end their lives, never had to consider whether they can afford to eat today or whether their children will have enough food to survive the winter. Their world is your world, but they inhabit it as gods while you scurry through it like a mouse, always alert for the shadow of the hawk that might swoop down and end your existence without warning or consequence. You see them gambling with amounts of money that would feed your family for months, discussing poetry and philosophy, while you worry about whether you can afford medicine for a sick child, planning elaborate parties while you calculate whether you can afford to heat your dwelling during the cold season. The public bathhouse draws your attention, one of the few places where social distinctions soften slightly, where naked bodies reveal the common humanity beneath the rigid costumes of hierarchy that normally define every human interaction. But even here, the rules persist with relentless precision. Certain areas are reserved for higher classes. The temperature and cleanliness of the water reflect your ability to pay premium fees, and conversations must still observe the proper forms of address that acknowledge everyone's place in the social order. Even in nakedness, you cannot escape the weight of your social position, the burden of inferiority that follows you everywhere and defines every relationship you have with other human beings. The water itself is stratified by class, with the cleanest and hottest pools reserved for samurai and wealthy merchants, while those of your station make do with cooler water that has already been used by others. The soap is rationed according to your ability to pay, and the towels available to you are rougher and less clean than those provided to your betters. Even the simple human pleasure of bathing becomes a reminder of your place in the hierarchy, a lesson in the reality that even basic comfort is a privilege that must be earned through birth or wealth rather than effort or merit. As darkness settles over the city, you realize that your entire day has been spent, not in productive work or personal fulfillment, but in the exhausting task of social navigation that drains your energy and spirit without providing any sense of accomplishment or progress. Every interaction has required careful calculation, every word has been weighed against possible consequences, every movement has been performed with an awareness of watching eyes and potential judgment from those who have the power to destroy you without consequence. The constant vigilance required to survive in this system leaves no mental energy for creativity, innovation, or the simple human joys that make existence worthwhile rather than merely bearable. The curfew bells begin to ring, signaling that the time for movement through the streets is ending, and that anyone found outside without proper authorization risks arrest, interrogation, and punishment. Like most aspects of life in Edo, your freedom to move about is strictly regulated by authorities, who view any unauthorized movement as potential subversion of the social order. After the appointed hour, being found on the streets without proper authorization can result in arrest, questioning that might last for days, and punishment that could range from fines your family cannot afford to imprisonment, or even execution depending on the mood of the officials and the political climate of the moment. The city that seemed so vibrant during daylight hours now transforms into a prison, its streets patrolled by officials who view any unauthorized movement as potential subversion worthy of investigation and punishment. The very darkness becomes an enemy, as moving through it without permission is seen as evidence of criminal intent or seditious planning, even if your only crime is working late to earn enough money to feed your family or visiting a sick relative who needs your care. You reach your dwelling and prepare for sleep on the same thin mattress that greeted you this morning, your body aching not just from physical labor, but from the constant tension of vigilance that is required to exist in a society that watches your every move and judges your every action. Your back hurts from bowing hundreds of times throughout the day, your neck is stiff from keeping your head lowered in the presence of your betters, and your shoulders ache from the weight of carrying yourself with the proper degree of submission that your station requires. Tomorrow will bring the same challenges, the same careful navigation of social minefields, the same grinding anxiety of life lived always on the edge of disaster for reasons entirely beyond your control. The same hunger will gnaw at your stomach, the same fear will tighten your chest, the same exhaustion will weigh down your limbs, as you perform the daily dance of survival in a system designed to crush your spirit and reduce you to a perfectly predictable component in a vast machine of social control. As you lie in the darkness, listening to the sounds of your neighbors settling into their own uneasy rest, the crying of children who are hungry but cannot be fed, the coughing of adults whose lungs are damaged from breathing the polluted air of the city, you understand why you would not survive in this world. It's not just the physical hardships, the poor food, the lack of sanitation, the constant threat of disease that sweeps through crowded neighborhoods like wildfire. It's the psychological weight of living in a society that has perfected the art of human control, where individual will has been so thoroughly crushed that most people cannot even imagine alternatives to their suffering. The beauty of cherry blossoms and the elegance of temple architecture cannot mask the fundamental truth. This is a world designed to break the human spirit, to reduce individual people to perfectly predictable components in a vast machine of social control that serves the interests of a small elite at the expense of everyone else. And in the morning, When the temple bells ring once again, you will rise and repeat this dance of survival, knowing that each day brings you no closer to freedom, only deeper into a system that has made resistance itself unthinkable and hope itself a dangerous luxury that could be interpreted as dissatisfaction with your divinely ordained place in the social order. This is why the cherry blossoms seem both beautiful and terrible, why the temple bells sound like both blessing and warning, carrying messages of transcendence and imprisonment in the same bronze voice. In Edo, Japan, even beauty serves the purposes of control, reminding you constantly that you exist, not for yourself, but as a small, expendable part of something larger and more powerful than you can ever hope to challenge or change. The very aesthetics of the culture become tools of oppression, teaching you to find meaning in submission and beauty in your own powerlessness, until you can no longer imagine what freedom might look like or whether you would even want it if it were offered to you. Chapter 2. The Last Samurai Who Refused to Die. Saigo Takamori's Impossible War. As we leave behind the suffocating world of the common merchant, let us turn our attention to a different kind of tragedy, that of a man born into privilege, who would ultimately choose death over compromise, honor over survival, principle over pragmatism, in a world that no longer valued such absolutes. The year is now 1877, and the Japan we have just experienced is crumbling like ancient wood in a typhoon, its rigid foundations shaking under pressures that 2 centuries of isolation could not prepare it to withstand. The rigid order that crushed individual will for over 2 centuries is giving way to something new, something Western, something that promises progress but demands the sacrifice of everything the old Japan held sacred and meaningful. The cherry blossoms still bloom in the same patterns they have followed for millennia, but they fall now on a world transforming so rapidly that each season brings changes that would have taken generations to unfold in earlier times. His name was Saigo Takamori, and history would remember him as the last true samurai, the final guardian of values that had shaped Japanese civilization for over 1,000 years. But to understand why this giant of a man, standing 6 feet tall in a nation of shorter people, weighing nearly 200 pounds in a culture that prized elegant slenderness, chose to die rather than live in the new Japan, we must first understand what made him and what broke him. We must follow his journey from humble beginnings to the heights of political power, from devoted servant of the emperor to doomed rebel against the very government he helped create, from the man who opened Japan's future to the one who closed its past forever. Saigo was born on January 23, 1828, in Kojiacho, Kagoshima, the castle town of Satsuma Domain, a place where samurai traditions ran deeper than anywhere else in the Japanese archipelago, like roots extending into the very bedrock of the land. Satsuma samurai were known for their fierce independence, their devotion to martial arts, and their suspicion of outside influence that bordered on paranoia but served them well in maintaining their distinct identity. Even within the rigid hierarchy of Tokugawa Japan, Satsuma maintained a stubborn distinctiveness, a sense that they were more purely Japanese than the court nobles and merchant-influenced samurai of Edo, more connected to the ancient sources of power and honor that had made Japan great before the long sleep of isolation began. Picture the young Saigo growing up in this environment of proud provincialism and ancient traditions, a world where a man's worth was measured not by his wealth, but by his willingness to die for his principles without hesitation or compromise, where children learned to recite poetry with the same intensity they brought to sword practice, understanding that both were forms of spiritual discipline that shaped the soul, where the cherry blossom was revered not for its beauty alone, but for its brief, perfect life, blooming brilliantly and then falling at the height of its glory, never lingering to wither and decay like those who compromised their ideals for the sake of mere survival. This was a culture that had perfected the art of finding meaning in transience, beauty in sacrifice, and honor in choosing death over dishonor when the two came into inevitable conflict. Saigo's childhood was marked by the grinding poverty that affected even the samurai class in Satsuma, where honor came without the wealth to support it comfortably and dignity had to be maintained on empty stomachs. His father served as a low-ranking samurai in the Satsuma administration, which meant the family lived with the pride of noble status, but without the financial resources to match their social position. The Saigo household was large, at its maximum totaling 16 people, including Saigo's parents, grandparents, his 6 younger siblings, and the family of his father's younger brother, all crowded into quarters that barely provided adequate shelter, let alone comfort or privacy. This grinding contradiction, honor without prosperity, status without security, pride without the means to support it, would shape Saigo's understanding of what it meant to be samurai in a changing world, where ancient values collided with modern realities. He learned early that true nobility lay not in material comfort, but in spiritual strength, not in what one possessed, but in what one was willing to sacrifice for higher principles. The family's financial struggles taught him that dignity could be maintained even in poverty, that honor was not dependent on external circumstances but on internal character, that no force could touch or corrupt unless one allowed it to be compromised. As a young man, Saigo threw himself into his studies with the intensity of someone who understood that knowledge was power, even for those born to wield swords rather than brushes. He mastered the classical Chinese texts that formed the foundation of samurai education, absorbing the wisdom of Confucian philosophers who taught that moral character was more important than military prowess. But he also began to question the rigid orthodoxies that governed his society, wondering whether traditions that had served Japan well in the past might become obstacles to survival in a rapidly changing world. When Western ships began appearing in Japanese waters with increasing frequency during his youth, Saigo was among the first to recognize that Japan's isolation could not last forever, that the island nation would soon have to choose between adaptation and destruction in a world where standing still meant falling behind. The moment that would define Saigo's life came in 1853, when Commodore Matthew Perry's black ships anchored in Edo Bay and demanded that Japan open its ports to Western trade with a show of force that left no room for negotiation. The sight of those steam-powered vessels, bristling with cannon and flying foreign flags, shattered the illusion of Japanese invincibility that had sustained the Tokugawa system for over 2 centuries like a carefully maintained dream, suddenly exposed to harsh daylight. Here was proof that the outside world had not stood still while Japan slept in isolation, that other nations had developed technologies and powers that made Japan's traditional strength seem suddenly obsolete and quaint. The very sea that had protected Japan for centuries now carried threats that no amount of courage or honor could turn aside through force of will alone. For most samurai, this revelation brought confusion and fear, a sense that the world they had known was ending and that they were powerless to prevent its destruction. For Saigo, it brought clarity like lightning illuminating a dark landscape, revealing truths that had been hidden in shadow but were always present for those with eyes to see. He understood, with the insight of a born strategist, that Japan had 2 choices: adapt or be conquered, modernize or be colonized, change or disappear from the map of independent nations. There was no middle ground, no way to preserve the old system while ignoring the new realities of global power that had made isolation not just impractical, but suicidal. But adaptation would require sacrifice, and the question that haunted Saigo was whether Japan could change without losing its soul, whether it could embrace Western technology while preserving Eastern values, whether modernization necessarily meant spiritual death. Saigo's rise to prominence began during the turbulent final years of the Tokugawa shogunate, when competing factions within Japan struggled to define the nation's response to Western pressure, like blind men trying to describe an elephant by touching different parts. He became a key figure in the movement to restore power to the emperor, believing that only a return to Japan's most ancient traditions could provide the spiritual foundation necessary for successful modernization. The irony was profound and would later torment him. In order to preserve what was essentially Japanese, Saigo found himself advocating for the destruction of the system that had defined Japan for over 2 centuries. The Tokugawa shogunate, with all its rigid hierarchies and suffocating controls, had become in Saigo's mind a foreign imposition that prevented Japan from accessing its true strength and authentic character. The restoration of Emperor Meiji in 1868 seemed, at first, to vindicate Saigo's vision and justify the sacrifices that had been made to achieve it. He had played a crucial role in the political and military campaigns that brought down the Tokugawa, and he found himself one of the most powerful men in the new government, positioned to shape Japan's future according to his ideals. Here, it seemed, was his opportunity to build a Japan that combined the best of traditional values with the technological progress necessary for survival in a modern world that respected only strength. He envisioned a nation that could stand as equal to any Western power, while maintaining the spiritual values that made it uniquely Japanese, a synthesis of East and West that would show the world a different path to modernity. But power revealed uncomfortable truths that idealism had obscured, and the reality of governing proved far more complex than the dream of restoration had suggested. The other leaders of the Meiji Restoration, particularly those who had traveled to the West and seen industrial civilization firsthand, believed that Japan's survival required not just technological modernization, but cultural transformation that would touch every aspect of Japanese life. They looked at the samurai class with its emphasis on honor over efficiency, tradition over innovation, personal loyalty over institutional effectiveness, and saw an obstacle to progress rather than a foundation for strength. They believed that Japan could not compete with Western powers while maintaining feudal structures that valued ancient privileges over modern capabilities. Saigo watched with growing horror as his fellow leaders implemented reforms that struck at the heart of everything he held sacred, each new law feeling like a betrayal of the principles that had motivated the restoration in the first place. The Han system, which had organized Japan into semi-autonomous domains ruled by traditional lords who maintained personal relationships with their subjects, was abolished in favor of centralized prefectures administered by government bureaucrats who knew nothing of local customs or needs. Samurai were stripped of their exclusive right to carry swords, the visible symbols of their status and the tools of their trade for over 1,000 years. Their annual rice stipends were converted to government bonds, transforming warriors into creditors of a state that might default on its obligations at any time. Their monopoly on military service was ended with the creation of a Western-style conscript army that drew soldiers from all social classes, making the samurai's martial expertise irrelevant in a world of mass-produced weapons and industrial warfare. Each reform made perfect sense from the perspective of modernization and efficiency, and Saigo could not argue with the logic even as he recoiled from the implications. A centralized government could mobilize resources more effectively than the old patchwork of competing domains that had defined feudal Japan. A modern army of trained conscripts would be more reliable than warriors motivated primarily by personal honor and feudal loyalty. An economy based on merit and innovation would generate more wealth than one bound by ancient privileges and hereditary restrictions. But for Saigo, these changes represented something more than administrative reform. They constituted a betrayal of everything that made Japan worth defending and preserving. What was the point of preserving national independence if the nation itself was transformed beyond recognition? Its soul extracted and replaced with foreign values that prioritized efficiency over honor. How could Japan maintain its spiritual integrity while adopting the materialistic values of the West? The same values that had driven Western nations to colonize and exploit other cultures. The modernization that was supposed to strengthen Japan seemed instead to be destroying everything that made it Japanese, creating a nation that might be powerful, but would no longer be authentic. Saigo began to see the Meiji government, not as the fulfillment of the restoration but as its betrayal, not as the salvation of Japan but as its spiritual conquest by foreign ideas. The breaking point came in 1873, during heated debates over whether Japan should launch a military expedition against Korea in response to that nation's refusal to recognize the new Meiji government. Saigo supported the expedition, not because he hungered for conquest or territorial expansion, but because he believed Japan needed a mission that would preserve the martial spirit of the samurai class, while directing their energies toward national service. The foreign war would give the samurai a purpose in the new Japan, a way to serve the emperor while maintaining their identity as warriors, rather than becoming mere functionaries in a bureaucratic state. It would also demonstrate to the world that Japan remained a nation of warriors, not merely successful imitators of Western civilization. His opponents, led by politicians who had witnessed Western military power firsthand during trips to Europe and America, recognized the proposal, a strategic madness that could destroy everything they had worked to build. Japan was still years away from building the industrial base necessary to support a modern military campaign against a foreign power. A war with Korea would likely draw in China and possibly Russia, powers that Japan was not yet ready to face in open conflict. The expedition would drain resources that were desperately needed for domestic development, and risk destroying the new government before it had time to establish itself and prove its legitimacy to skeptical samurai and suspicious peasants. The debate revealed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Saigo's vision, a contradiction he could never fully resolve or accept. He wanted Japan to be strong enough to resist Western domination, while maintaining the values and institutions that had made Japan unique among nations. But strength in the modern world required the very changes that threatened traditional values and social structures. There was no way to build railways and factories while preserving a society based on rice cultivation and hereditary privilege. There was no way to create a modern military while maintaining the samurai's exclusive claim to warrior status and social superiority. The choice was binary: modernize and lose the soul of Japan, or preserve tradition and lose Japan itself to foreign conquest. When the government rejected his Korean expedition proposal, Saigo resigned from his positions and returned to Satsuma, taking with him hundreds of other disaffected samurai who shared his disillusionment with the direction of modernization. In Satsuma, far from the compromises and calculations of Tokyo politics, Saigo established a series of private schools where young samurai could study traditional martial arts alongside modern military techniques, hoping to preserve the warrior spirit while adapting to new realities. These schools became something more than educational institutions. They became the nucleus of a counter-revolution, a gathering place for men who refused to accept that honor and efficiency were incompatible, that Japan could only survive by abandoning everything that had made it Japan. For 4 years, Saigo lived quietly in Satsuma, teaching and reflecting, while the Meiji government continued its relentless program of modernization that seemed to accelerate with each passing month. But quiet was not in Saigo's nature, and the contradictions that had driven him from government service continued to gnaw at his conscience like a wound that would not heal. Around him he saw former samurai struggling to find their place in a world that no longer valued their skills or respected their status. Men who had devoted their lives to the warrior's path, suddenly told that their devotion was worthless. Some became merchants, abandoning the warrior's code for the pursuit of profit that had always been considered beneath the samurai class. Others became farmers, trading their swords for plows in a transformation that seemed to mock everything they had once represented. A few found positions in the new military or bureaucracy, but even these successes felt like defeats, like admissions that the old ways were indeed obsolete and that adaptation required abandoning one's principles. The spark that ignited Saigo's final rebellion came in early 1877, when government agents attempted to seize the weapons stored at his private schools, under the pretext of preventing armed insurrection. The official justification was that these weapons posed a threat to public order, but Saigo and his followers understood the action as something more symbolic, an attempt to disarm not just their bodies but their spirits, to complete the process of transforming samurai from warriors into ordinary citizens. The seizure of weapons was the final step in the emasculation of the samurai class, the moment when even the pretense of martial identity would be stripped away forever. Saigo faced a choice that would define not only his own legacy, but the meaning of the Meiji Restoration itself, a choice between submission and rebellion, between accepting the new order and dying for the old one. He could submit to government authority, accept the confiscation of weapons, and watch his schools transform from centers of traditional learning into institutions that served the new order like all others. Or he could resist, knowing that resistance meant not just political opposition, but armed rebellion against the government he had helped create, against the emperor he claimed to serve, against the very ideals of national unity and progress that had motivated the restoration in the first place. The choice for Saigo was no choice at all, because submission would mean accepting that everything he had fought for during the restoration had been meaningless. To submit would be to acknowledge that the emperor he claimed to serve was merely a figurehead for leaders who valued Western approval over Japanese integrity, that the restoration had been not a return to authentic Japanese values, but their final betrayal. To resist would almost certainly mean death, but it would also mean remaining true to the principles that had guided his entire life, dying with honor rather than living with shame. On January 29, 1877, Saigo Takamori led approximately 25,000 samurai out of Kagoshima and began the march toward Kumamoto, where government forces were concentrated under the command of his old friend General Yamagata Aritomo. It was not a march toward victory. Saigo was too intelligent a strategist to believe that swords and traditional tactics could defeat a modern army equipped with breech-loading rifles and artillery supported by telegraph communications and railroad transport. It was a march toward martyrdom, a deliberate choice to die in a manner that would preserve the honor of the samurai class, even as it acknowledged their obsolescence in the modern world. The Satsuma Rebellion lasted 8 months, from January to September 1877, and its course followed the inevitable logic of traditional valor confronting modern warfare in a contest where courage alone could not overcome technological superiority. Saigo's forces won early victories through superior morale and intimate knowledge of local terrain, but each success only delayed the ultimate outcome that had been determined by industrial capacity rather than warrior spirit. The government forces, initially demoralized by facing legendary samurai warriors in battle, gradually learned to rely on their technological advantages and superior numbers rather than matching the enemy in hand-to-hand combat. The siege of Kumamoto Castle became the symbol of the rebellion's tragic heroism, a perfect metaphor for the collision between Old Japan and New Japan that defined the entire Meiji period. For weeks, Saigo's forces surrounded the government garrison, conducting their assault with all the pageantry and ritual of traditional warfare, even as they faced enemies who had abandoned such customs for more practical methods. Samurai commanders composed poetry before leading charges against machine gun positions, following ancient customs that honored the moment of death as much as the hope of victory. Warriors who had trained for decades in the arts of single combat found themselves facing enemies who fought from trenches and relied on mass firepower rather than individual skill, reducing warfare to a matter of industrial production rather than personal valor. As the siege continued, the fundamental inequality of the contest became increasingly apparent to everyone except perhaps Saigo himself, who seemed determined to play out the drama to its inevitable conclusion. Government forces received regular resupply by railroad, while Saigo's army depended on what they could carry or capture from increasingly wary enemies. Modern medical techniques kept government casualties fighting longer and more effectively, while wounded samurai relied on traditional remedies that were inadequate for treating gunshot wounds and artillery shrapnel. Most importantly, the government could replace its losses by conscripting new soldiers from the general population, while each samurai who fell represented the irreplaceable loss of years of training and cultural knowledge that could never be recovered. The end came at Shiroyama, a hill overlooking Kagoshima, where Saigo and his remaining 500 followers made their final stand against 30,000 government troops equipped with modern weapons and unlimited ammunition. By this point, the rebellion had been reduced to its essential elements, a small group of men who preferred death to submission, facing an army that represented everything they rejected about the New Japan and everything they feared about the future of their country. The hill itself became a stage for the final act of a drama that had been playing out across Japan for decades. The last confrontation between a world that valued honor above life and a world that valued efficiency above honor. On the morning of September 24, 1877, Saigo prepared for battle with the same ritual care his ancestors had brought to combat for over 1,000 years, following customs that connected him to an unbroken chain of warriors, stretching back to the mythical origins of Japan itself. He composed a final poem, performed the ceremonies that would prepare his spirit for death, and said farewell to the few followers who remained with him after months of fighting and retreat. Then, as government artillery began its final bombardment of their position, Saigo led his men in one last charge down the slopes of Shiroyama, not because he believed it could succeed, but because dying in battle was preferable to surrender or capture. The battle lasted less than an hour, ending not with the dramatic single combat of traditional warfare, but with the methodical efficiency of modern military technology. Modern weapons cut down the charging samurai with methodical precision, their traditional armor and ancient tactics proving as obsolete as Saigo had always known they would be. When a government bullet shattered his thigh and left him unable to continue fighting, Saigo turned to his most trusted retainer, Beppu Shinsuke, and enlisted the final service assistance in performing seppuku, the ritualized suicide that would allow him to die with honor rather than face the shame of capture and trial as a rebel against the state he had once served. Saigo Takamori died as he had lived, according to principles that the modern world found both admirable and impossible, noble and impractical, beautiful and anachronistic. His death marked not just the end of a rebellion, but the end of an entire way of understanding what it meant to be Japanese in a world that no longer had room for such understanding. With him died the last serious attempt to preserve the samurai class as more than a romantic memory, the last hope that Japan could modernize without fundamentally transforming its character and abandoning its spiritual foundations. The cherry blossoms that fell on his body carried with them the accumulated weight of 1,000 years of tradition that could no longer survive in the harsh light of modernity. Yet even in defeat, Saigo achieved a kind of victory that his enemies could not take from him, and that time could not diminish. His willingness to die for his principles, his choice of honor over compromise, resonated deeply with Japanese people who were struggling to find meaning in the rapid changes, transforming their society beyond recognition. Within a few years of his death, Saigo was being celebrated not as a traitor but as a tragic hero, a man who had preserved something essential about the Japanese spirit, even as he acknowledged its practical obsolescence in the modern world. The government that had destroyed him eventually erected statues in his honor, recognizing that even in rebellion he had served the deeper interests of Japan by maintaining ideals that efficiency alone could never replace. The emperor for whom he had died pardoned him posthumously, acknowledging that his rebellion had been motivated not by personal ambition, but by loyalty to principles that transcended political considerations. The Japan that had rejected his vision nevertheless maintained his memory as a reminder of values that modernization could not entirely replace, even as it continued down the path of westernization that he had opposed. Saigo became the last samurai not because he was the final member of that class to die, but because he was the last to die for what that class had originally represented: the willingness to sacrifice everything for honor, loyalty, and the preservation of spiritual values in a world increasingly dominated by material consideration. Saigo Takamori's story reveals the profound tragedy at the heart of Japan's modernization, the recognition that survival in the modern world required the sacrifice of much that had made traditional life meaningful and spiritually satisfying. His rebellion was doomed from the start, but its very hopelessness gave it a purity that purely practical politics could never achieve, a clarity of purpose that cut through the compromises and calculations that characterized the new Japan. In choosing death over adaptation, honor over survival, principle over pragmatism, Saigo preserved something that would otherwise have been lost forever in the rush toward modernity. As we reflect on Saigo's choice, death over compromise, honor over survival, spiritual integrity over material success, we glimpse something of what was lost when the old Japan gave way to the new. The samurai ideal of choosing a beautiful death over an ignoble life seems foreign to our modern sensibilities, yet it speaks to human longings that material progress cannot entirely satisfy: the desire for meaning beyond comfort, for principles worth dying for a sense that individual choices matter, even when they not change the ultimate outcome of historical forces. The cherry blossoms that surrounded Saigo's final battle continue to bloom and fall according to the same ancient rhythms, but they fall now on a world that has forgotten how to find beauty in sacrifice, meaning in loss, and honor in choosing principle over survival, when the two come into irreconcilable conflict. In the end, Saigo Takamori became what he had always aspired to be: not a successful politician or a victorious general, but a perfect embodiment of the samurai spirit carried to its logical conclusion. His death marked the end of one Japan and the beginning of another, but it also preserved something timeless about the human capacity for sacrifice in service of ideals that transcend mere survival and material success. The last samurai died, not because he was defeated in battle, but because he chose to embody values that the modern world could admire, but no longer live by, principles that remained beautiful, precisely because they were no longer practical in a world that had chosen efficiency over honor, progress over tradition, and survival over the spiritual considerations that had once made survival seem worth the effort required to achieve it. Chapter 3: The Mystery of the Ninja Villages That Never Existed. From the tragic nobility of Saigo Takamori's final stand, we now turn to explore one of history's most persistent mysteries, not the mystery of what happened, but the mystery of what never happened at all. The fascinating puzzle of how fictional characters became more famous than the real people they supposedly represent. We enter the shadowy world of the ninja, where centuries of myth and reality have become so thoroughly intertwined that separating truth from fiction requires the patience of an archaeologist, the skepticism of a detective, and the wisdom to understand that sometimes the stories we tell about the past reveal more about ourselves than about what actually occurred in ages long gone. Close your eyes and imagine what the word ninja conjures in your mind, letting the images flow freely without questioning their source or accuracy. Perhaps you see a figure dressed entirely in black, moving silently across rooftops under the cover of darkness, like a shadow given human form. Maybe you envision secret villages hidden in mountain valleys, where children train from birth in the arts of assassination and espionage, their young minds shaped by ancient masters who guard secrets passed down through generations of shadow warriors. You might picture throwing stars glinting in moonlight, or warriors who can disappear in clouds of smoke, or ancient scrolls containing supernatural techniques that transform ordinary humans into instruments of death capable of feats that defy the laws of physics and human limitation. These images feel so real, so deeply embedded in our collective understanding of feudal Japan, that it comes as a profound shock to learn that virtually none of them have any basis in historical reality. The ninja of popular imagination, the black-clad assassins, with their exotic weapons and supernatural abilities, are largely the creation of 20th century fiction, as fictional as the samurai who never existed, and the Japan that never was, products of imagination, rather than historical investigation. The gap between the fictional ninja and the historical shinobi is so vast that they might as well be entirely different species, separated not just by centuries, but by the fundamental difference between what we wish had happened and what actually occurred. But this raises a fascinating question that goes to the heart of how human beings create meaning from the past. If the ninja of popular culture are fantasy, what were the real shinobi? What traces did they leave in the historical record? And why did their true story become so thoroughly obscured by centuries of myth-making that has transformed them into something they never were? How did ordinary people performing practical functions become legendary figures possessed of superhuman abilities and supernatural powers that exist only in the realm of imagination? The word ninja itself is a relatively modern invention, a reading of two Chinese characters that can also be pronounced shinobi, the term actually used during the feudal period, when these individuals were active. These characters mean to steal away or to hide, and they described not a hereditary class of professional assassins living in hidden villages and practicing supernatural arts, but a tactical role that could be filled by almost anyone with the right skills and motivation. Much like modern special forces operators who are drawn from regular military units rather than raised from birth in secret training facilities. To understand what shinobi actually were, we must first understand what they were not, because the popular misconceptions are so pervasive that they have become more influential than historical fact. They were not a separate social class like the samurai, with their own distinct culture and rigid code of honor that set them apart from ordinary society. They were not born into ninja families that passed down secret techniques through bloodlines, creating dynasties of shadow warriors whose children learned deadly arts before they learned to read. They were not trained from childhood in mysterious arts that transformed them into superhuman warriors, capable of feats that violated the laws of physics, nor did they possess supernatural powers that allowed them to become invisible, walk on water, or control the elements through mystical knowledge. Instead, the historical shinobi were ordinary people, farmers, monks, merchants, and yes, sometimes samurai, who performed intelligence gathering and unconventional warfare as needed, rather than as a permanent profession. They were the feudal equivalent of what we might today call special operations forces, soldiers trained for missions that required stealth, deception, and adaptability, rather than the direct confrontation that characterized traditional samurai warfare. Their skills were practical rather than mystical, based on careful observation and preparation rather than supernatural powers, and they were valued for their ability to gather information and conduct irregular operations, rather than for their prowess as assassins. The confusion about ninja begins with geography and the persistent legends about their supposed strongholds. Popular culture speaks of legendary ninja strongholds, particularly in the mountainous Iga and Koga regions of central Japan, as if these were hidden kingdoms ruled by shadow masters, who commanded armies of black-clad warriors. The reality is both more mundane and more interesting, revealing how ordinary communities developed extraordinary skills in response to extraordinary circumstances. Iga and Koga were indeed centers of unconventional warfare expertise, but not because they harbored secret ninja villages populated by hereditary assassins living apart from normal society. These regions were politically complex borderlands, caught between competing domains, and never fully controlled by any single power, making them natural laboratories for the development of irregular warfare techniques. The farmers and local samurai who lived there developed skills in guerrilla warfare, intelligence gathering, and irregular tactics out of necessity. They needed these abilities to survive in a world where traditional military protection was unreliable and competing warlords constantly threatened their independence. The mountainous terrain that surrounded these communities provided natural defensive advantages but also required them to develop specialized knowledge of hidden paths, defensible positions, and survival techniques that would later be romanticized as ninja magic, but were actually practical adaptations to geographic and political realities. Archaeological evidence from Iga and Koga tells a story very different from the Hollywood version, revealing not secret training facilities or hidden weapon caches, but the remains of ordinary agricultural communities that happened to develop exceptional military capabilities. Excavations have revealed not underground ninja lairs or mystical training grounds, but the foundations of farmhouses, rice storage facilities, and small temples that served local communities. The tools found in these sites are overwhelmingly farming implements, hoes, sickles, and plows, rather than throwing stars and exotic weapons that populate ninja mythology. When weapons are found, they are typically conventional spears, swords, and bows that any rural community might possess for self-defense, rather than the specialized ninja equipment of popular imagination. This doesn't mean the people of these regions were not formidable fighters, because the archaeological evidence also reveals sophisticated defensive preparations and military planning. On the contrary, they developed a reputation for military effectiveness that was based on very real skills and careful preparation. But these skills were those of irregular warriors and intelligence operatives, not supernatural assassins capable of defying the laws of physics. The defensive earthworks found in these areas show careful planning and engineering expertise, while the positioning of settlements reveals intimate knowledge of terrain and tactical considerations that would give defenders significant advantages over conventional armies. Hidden supply caches and escape routes demonstrate systematic preparation for prolonged resistance, but they are the work of practical military planners rather than mystical ninja masters. The most famous figure associated with historical ninja is Hattori Hanzo, whose name has become synonymous with legendary ninja mastery in popular culture, but whose historical reality was far different from his fictional representation. Popular culture depicts him as the ultimate shadow warrior, a man who could appear and disappear at will, who commanded armies of black-clad assassins living in hidden mountain fortresses, and whose descendants guarded the secrets of ninjutsu for centuries through an unbroken chain of mystical knowledge. The fictional Hattori Hanzo is a figure of almost supernatural ability, capable of feats that border on magic and possessed of knowledge that transcends ordinary human understanding. The historical Hattori Hanzo was indeed a remarkable figure, but his remarkable qualities were those of a skilled military leader and intelligence coordinator, not a supernatural warrior possessed of mystical powers. Born around, he served Tokugawa Ieyasu, the man who would eventually become the first Tokugawa shogun, as a specialist in unconventional warfare and intelligence operations, demonstrating the practical skills that irregular warfare required rather than the supernatural abilities that fiction attributes to ninja. His background was not that of a hereditary ninja master raised from birth in secret arts, but of a samurai from a family with connections to the Iga region, making him valuable for his local knowledge and political connections rather than mystical training. Hanzo's most famous achievement was orchestrating Tokugawa's escape from Osaka to his home territory of Mikawa in 1582, following the death of Oda Nobunaga in an incident that left Tokugawa vulnerable to his enemies and stranded in hostile territory. This journey required traveling through territory controlled by hostile forces who would have killed or captured Tokugawa if they had found him, avoiding detection by enemy patrols who were actively searching for the fugitive lord, and coordinating with local allies who could provide shelter and information without revealing their assistance to potential enemies. It was a complex intelligence operation that required careful planning, extensive local knowledge, and the ability to improvise when circumstances changed. But there was nothing supernatural about what Hanzo accomplished. He succeeded through preparation, local knowledge, and the support of networks of farmers and minor samurai who had reason to support Tokugawa, rather than through mystical ninja arts or supernatural abilities. His ninja army was not a force of hereditary shadow warriors trained from birth in secret techniques, but a temporary alliance of irregular fighters motivated by political loyalty and the promise of reward when Tokugawa regained power. The escape route through Iga and Koga was chosen not because these regions were ruled by ninja masters, but because Hanzo had family connections and political relationships that made safe passage possible through careful coordination, rather than mystical intervention. The weapons associated with ninja and popular culture provide another window into the gap between myth and reality, revealing how ordinary tools became transformed into legendary implements through the alchemy of storytelling and cultural transmission. Throwing stars, or shuriken, did exist in feudal Japan, but they were not the primary weapons of legendary assassins capable of killing with a single perfectly aimed throw. Instead, they were supplementary tools used by various types of warriors, including conventional samurai, as backup weapons or distraction devices rather than primary instruments of death. Most shuriken were not designed for throwing at all, but were handheld weapons used for close combat situations when swords were impractical or unavailable, serving functions similar to modern tactical knives, rather than the mystical projectiles of ninja legend. The exotic weapons that appear in ninja movies, chain sickles, multi-pronged daggers, and collapsible spears that seemed to possess almost magical properties, were real implements, but they were not the exclusive tools of a secret warrior class living apart from normal society. Many were adaptations of farming tools or specialized weapons, used by various types of fighters depending on their specific needs and circumstances, rather than the signature equipment of a hereditary ninja caste. A chain sickle, for example, was indeed a weapon used in some martial traditions, but it was also a practical tool for cutting grain that could be pressed into service during conflicts when regular weapons were unavailable, demonstrating the practical rather than mystical nature of most ninja equipment. The black clothing that has become the universal ninja uniform is perhaps the most persistent myth of all, and also the one that reveals most clearly how theatrical conventions became confused with historical reality over the centuries of cultural transmission. Historical evidence suggests that shinobi, when they needed to move unseen, dressed to blend into their specific environment, rather than wearing a standardized uniform that would make them instantly recognizable. In rural areas, this might mean the brown and grey clothing of farmers that would allow them to pass unnoticed among agricultural workers, while in urban areas, it might mean the robes of monks, or the garments of merchants that would provide cover for intelligence-gathering activities. The association of ninja with black clothing appears to come from a misunderstanding of kabuki theater conventions, revealing how artistic representations can become more influential than historical reality when they appeal to popular imagination. In kabuki, stagehands who moved props and assisted with scene changes wore black clothing and were considered invisible by convention. Audiences were trained to ignore them as part of the theatrical experience, understanding that they were not part of the story being performed even though they were clearly visible on stage. When kabuki plays featured characters who were supposed to be invisible or moving unseen, these characters were also dressed in black, taking advantage of the audience's conditioning to ignore black-clad figures as non-participants in the dramatic action. Over time, this theatrical convention became confused with historical reality, and the black-clad stagehand became transformed into the black-clad ninja through a process of cultural evolution that had nothing to do with historical accuracy. It's a perfect example of how cultural symbols can take on lives of their own, eventually becoming more real in popular consciousness than the historical facts they supposedly represent, and how artistic conventions can become historical facts through repetition and cultural transmission rather than evidence or research. The transformation of shinobi from historical figures into mythical ones accelerated during the Edo period itself, as Japan entered an era of peace under Tokugawa rule, and the practical skills of irregular warfare became less relevant to daily life. As Japan became unified and peaceful, the dangerous but necessary work of intelligence gathering and unconventional warfare became obsolete. But the stories of these skills became more fascinating to people who no longer faced the harsh realities that had made such abilities necessary for survival. Like many warrior traditions that survived their practical usefulness, ninjutsu became romanticized and mythologized by people who had never experienced the brutal realities of irregular warfare, but found the stories exciting and exotic. Professional storytellers and writers of popular fiction found ninja stories irresistible material for entertainment, because the very secrecy that had made shinobi effective as intelligence operatives made them perfect subjects for fantasy and speculation. Since little was definitively known about their methods, writers could attribute almost any capability to them without fear of contradiction from historical sources, allowing imagination to fill the gaps left by historical silence. The transformation from practical irregular warriors to supernatural shadow assassins began during this period, as each generation of storytellers added new elements to the mythology without regard for historical accuracy or plausibility. By the late Edo period, ninja had become stock characters in popular literature, possessed of abilities that would have been impossible for any human being to achieve through training alone. They could walk on water, become invisible, and kill with a touch that stopped the heart through mystical knowledge rather than practical weapons. They commanded supernatural powers that allowed them to control the elements and communicate with animals, transforming them from skilled but human operatives into fantasy figures possessed of magical abilities. They were no longer human beings using practical skills developed through training and experience, but fantasy figures possessed of magical abilities that existed only in the realm of imagination and popular entertainment. This process of mythologization continued into the modern era, where ninja became global cultural exports that spread far beyond their Japanese origins. Movies, television shows, Comic books and video games from around the world have taken the already highly fictionalized version of ninja from Japanese popular culture and added even more layers of fantasy and impossibility, creating a feedback loop in which each new iteration becomes more removed from historical reality. The result is that today, most people's understanding of ninja comes not from historical sources, but from a long chain of fictional interpretations, each one adding new elements to the mythology, without regard for accuracy or plausibility. We have reached the point where the fictional ninja is far more famous and culturally influential than the historical shinobi ever were, creating a situation in which imagination has triumphed over history in the popular consciousness. The black-clad, supernatural ninja of popular culture has become the real ninja in most people's minds, while the historical shinobi farmers and minor samurai who developed practical skills for irregular warfare have been forgotten or dismissed as less interesting than their fictional counterparts. But this raises intriguing questions about the nature of historical truth itself, and the relationship between fact and fiction in human culture. In what sense do the fictional ninja exist if they have shaped cultural understanding, influenced martial arts development around the world, and inspired countless real people to study what they believe to be ancient ninja techniques, even though these techniques are largely modern inventions? When mythology becomes more influential than history, which one represents the more important truth about human nature and cultural development? Does it matter that the ninja of popular culture never existed if they continue to inspire and influence people in the real world? Recent archaeological discoveries in the Iga region have provided new insights into what life was actually like in these supposed ninja strongholds, offering evidence that supports the historical reality of practical irregular warfare rather than the mythology of supernatural shadow warriors. Rather than finding evidence of secret training facilities or hidden weapon caches that would support popular ninja mythology, archaeologists have uncovered a complex network of ordinary farming communities that were connected by sophisticated intelligence networks designed for practical defense rather than mystical purposes. These communities developed elaborate systems for gathering and sharing information about political and military developments, maintaining detailed knowledge of local terrain, including hidden paths and defensive positions that could be used to resist invasion or conduct irregular operations against superior forces. They practiced forms of irregular warfare that emphasized mobility, surprise, and local knowledge over the formal combat techniques of conventional samurai armies, developing tactics that were practical responses to geographic and political realities, rather than mystical arts passed down through secret traditions. But perhaps most importantly, they were integrated into the broader political and economic systems of their time, rather than existing as a separate ninja society. The people of Iga and Koga were not mysterious outsiders living apart from Japanese society in hidden villages ruled by shadow masters. They were participants in that society who had developed specialized skills that made them valuable to various political leaders when conventional military approaches were inadequate. The decline of historical shinobi can be traced to the same forces that ended the age of the samurai, as Japan entered the Edo period, and then the modern era, where the skills of irregular warfare and intelligence gathering became less relevant to a society that was increasingly peaceful. As the Tokugawa shogunate established control over Japan and ended the constant warfare that had characterized earlier periods, the practical demand for intelligence operatives and irregular fighters diminished to the point where these skills were no longer necessary for survival or political success. The last documented use of shinobi in anything resembling their traditional role was during the Boshin War of when both sides in the conflict that ended the Tokugawa shogunate employed irregular fighters with skills descended from the shinobi tradition, but these were final echoes of a military culture that was already becoming obsolete in a world of modern warfare and centralized government. The real mystery of the ninja, then, is not what supernatural powers they possessed or what secret techniques they practiced, because these abilities exist only in the realm of fiction and popular imagination. The real mystery is how a relatively minor aspect of feudal Japanese warfare became transformed into one of the most persistent and influential mythologies of the modern world, and what this transformation reveals about human nature and cultural development. Perhaps the answer lies in what the ninja mythology provides that historical reality cannot offer to people seeking meaning and excitement in an increasingly complex world. The fictional ninja represents the fantasy of perfect competence, of individuals who have mastered their environment so completely that they can move through it unseen and unchallenged, possessing abilities that transcend ordinary human limitations through discipline and training. In a world where most people feel powerless and constantly observed, the idea of invisible warriors who answer to no authority but their own holds obvious appeal, offering a form of escapism that allows people to imagine themselves possessed of similar capabilities and independence. The ninja myth also provides a romantic alternative to the rigid hierarchies that characterized much of Japanese history, because while samurai were bound by elaborate codes of honor and social obligation that restricted their freedom of action, the fictional ninja is portrayed as free from such constraints, able to use any method and serve any master that suits their purposes without regard for conventional morality or social expectations. But perhaps most importantly, the ninja mythology offers the comfort of hidden knowledge, the suggestion that there are ancient secrets that can transform ordinary people into extraordinary ones through dedication and proper instruction. In a world that often seems random and uncontrollable, the idea that there are techniques, martial, mental, or spiritual, that can provide mastery and invulnerability offers a form of psychological comfort that historical reality cannot match, regardless of whether such techniques actually exist or have ever existed. The promise that ordinary people can become extraordinary through secret knowledge and dedicated training appeals to fundamental human desires for self-improvement and control over one's environment, even when the knowledge in question is entirely fictional. The transformation of shinobi into ninja thus represents something larger than the evolution of a single historical misconception, but rather illustrates how human beings transform the messy complexities of historical reality into the clean simplicities of myth. When reality fails to provide the meaning and excitement that people seek, it shows how these myths can eventually become more powerful and influential than the realities they replace, shaping behavior and inspiring action in ways that historical facts rarely achieve. The fictional ninja may not have existed in feudal Japan, but they have shaped the real world in ways that the historical shinobi never could, influencing martial arts development, popular culture, and even military thinking around the globe through the power of imagination rather than historical accuracy. They have inspired countless people to study martial arts, to seek self-improvement through discipline and training, and to believe in the possibility of transcending ordinary human limitations through dedication and proper instruction, even though the specific techniques and abilities they seek are largely products of imagination rather than historical tradition. In the end, the mystery of the ninja villages that never existed may be more revealing than the history of the shinobi who actually did exist in feudal Japan. It shows us how human imagination can create realities that are more lasting and influential than historical facts, and how the stories we tell about the past often say more about our present desires and fears than about what actually happened in ages long gone. The fictional ninja has become more real than the historical shinobi, not because the fiction is true, but because it serves human needs that historical reality cannot satisfy, providing meaning and inspiration that transcends the limitations of what actually occurred in a world that increasingly values entertainment over accuracy and inspiration over truth. Chapter 4. Inside the Shogun's Palace. When ultimate power became ultimate prison. Here, in chambers so magnificent that their very beauty has become a form of imprisonment, we encounter the final paradox of Tokugawa Japan, how the pursuit of perfect control created perfect isolation, and how absolute power became absolute captivity for those who wielded it. The palace that was meant to be the seat of ultimate authority became instead a gilded cage, where those who commanded the lives of millions found their own lives, commanded by protocols so elaborate that spontaneity became impossible, and freedom became a luxury that even gods could not afford. We have journeyed from the suffocating life of common merchants through the tragic nobility of the last samurai, and into the shadowy realm where history becomes myth. Now, as our exploration of Edo Japan draws toward its close, let us step through the most heavily guarded gates in the nation, past ranks of silent guards whose eyes never meet those they protect, through courtyards where every stone has been placed according to ancient protocol, and every flower planted with mathematical precision. We move into the heart of absolute power itself, the Shogun's palace in Edo, where magnificence and misery intertwined like lovers in a deadly embrace. But to understand the peculiar nature of power in Tokugawa Japan, we must begin not with the shogun himself, but with the system that surrounded him like a beautiful, suffocating web, designed to ensure that power never escaped the hands of those deemed worthy to wield it. The Sankan Kotai, or alternate residence system, required every daimyo, every regional lord who controlled vast territories and commanded thousands of samurai, to maintain elaborate residences in Edo, and to spend alternate years in the capital, attending the shogun's court like planets orbiting a distant sun. The Edo castle was more than a residence. It was a physical manifestation of the Tokugawa system itself, a vast complex of buildings, gardens, and ceremonial spaces that covered an area larger than many feudal domains. With an outer perimeter of 16 kilometers and an inner compound of 8 kilometers, it was the largest castle complex in the world, a city within a city where tens of thousands of people lived and worked in service to a single family. Within its walls lived not just the shogun and his immediate family, but thousands of servants, administrators, guards, and officials who formed a complete society dedicated to the maintenance of ultimate authority through the careful orchestration of every detail of daily life. Picture the scene that unfolded daily within the castle grounds. Hundreds of the most powerful men in Japan, each commanding territories that in earlier times might have been independent kingdoms, reduced to the status of courtiers whose primary occupation was waiting for audiences with a man who might grant them a few minutes of formal conversation. The daimyo, who in their own domains were absolute rulers, became, in Edo, supplicants whose wealth was systematically drained by the expense of maintaining dual households, and whose power was neutered by their physical separation from their territories for half of each year. Every spring and fall, the roads to Edo filled with elaborate processions, each one a carefully choreographed display of submission disguised as honor, as daimyo traveled between their domains and their mandatory residences in the capital. This was not an accident, but a deliberate strategy of control, conceived by minds that understood power, not as the ability to command through force alone, but as the capacity to make resistance seem impossible through the careful manipulation of circumstances. The Tokugawa understood that the greatest threat to their authority came not from foreign enemies. Japan's isolation ensured there were none, but from the very lords who had helped them achieve power, and who possessed the resources and legitimacy to challenge their rule. By requiring these lords to spend enormous sums on maintaining Edo residences that rivaled palaces in their luxury, by separating them from their power bases for half of each year, and by holding their families essentially as hostages while they were away, the Tokugawa created a system that made rebellion both financially ruinous and practically impossible. The daily life of the shogun himself reveals the strange nature of absolute authority in this carefully controlled world, where ultimate power became ultimate subjugation to the very system that granted that power. Every moment of his existence was governed by protocols so elaborate that spontaneity became impossible. Every action predetermined by traditions so ancient that their original purposes had been forgotten, but their authority remained absolute. He woke at prescribed times determined by astronomers and court officials, ate prescribed foods prepared in prescribed ways by cooks whose families had performed these same functions for generations, wore clothing chosen according to ancient rules that took into account not just the season and weather, but the phase of the moon and the alignment of celestial bodies. But the cost of this perfect control was the transformation of the shogun's court into something unprecedented in Japanese history. A center of power that was completely divorced from practical governance, a magnificent theater where the drama of authority was performed daily for an audience that dared not look away. The real business of running Japan was conducted by a vast bureaucracy of administrators and officials who never saw the shogun, while the ceremonial center of power became exactly that, purely ceremonial, a beautiful and elaborate ritual that had lost connection to the practical realities of governing a nation. The morning ritual of dressing the shogun required dozens of attendants, each responsible for a specific aspect of the elaborate process that could take hours to complete properly. The silk robes, imported from the finest weavers in Kyoto, and dyed according to formulas, guarded as state secret the formal hakama trousers, whose precise measurements were recorded in official documents, the ceremonial swords that were works of art rather than weapons. Each item had to be presented and donned according to traditions that stretched back centuries. The shogun could not simply choose what to wear based on comfort or preference. Every garment carried symbolic meaning that reflected his role as the embodiment of proper order, and wearing the wrong robe, or fastening a sash incorrectly, could be interpreted as a sign of cosmic imbalance that might require extensive purification rituals to correct. Even his meals were expressions of political philosophy rather than personal taste, transformed from simple acts of nourishment into elaborate ceremonies that reinforced the cosmic order through culinary symbolism. The food was prepared by specialized cooks who had inherited their positions from their fathers in an unbroken chain, stretching back to the founding of the Tokugawa dynasty, using recipes that had been refined over generations and tested by official tasters who ensured that every dish met not just standards of safety, but of symbolic appropriateness. The dishes were arranged on specific types of lacquerware, whose designs carried political meaning, served in a particular order that reflected the proper hierarchy of flavors and textures, and consumed according to etiquette, so complex that every movement of the chopsticks carried symbolic weight that could be read by trained observers for signs of the shogun's state of mind. But perhaps the most striking aspect of the shogun's daily existence was the profound loneliness that absolute power imposed. The peculiar isolation that comes from being surrounded constantly by hundreds of people, while being cut off from genuine human contact by barriers of protocol and hierarchy that made authentic relationships impossible. Surrounded constantly by attendants, advisors, and supplicants, he was nevertheless isolated from genuine human contact by the very system that elevated him above ordinary mortality. Consider the challenge of friendship for someone whose word was literally law, whose slightest expression of displeasure could destroy lives, and whose favor could elevate the humblest courtier to positions of wealth and influence. How could the shogun ever know whether someone's agreement with his opinions reflected genuine conviction or merely prudent self-preservation designed to avoid punishment or curry favor? How could he distinguish between authentic affection and calculated flattery, when every person who approached him had powerful incentives to disguise their true feelings? Every conversation was potentially a performance. Every expression of loyalty might mask resentment or ambition. Every smile might conceal fear or contempt. How the shogun lived in a world where truth became impossible to discern, because everyone around him had compelling reasons to lie, not from malice but from the simple human desire to survive and prosper in a system where honesty could be fatal. This isolation was most pronounced in the most intimate aspects of life, where the heart's deepest needs collided with the cold requirements of dynastic politics. The oku, or women's quarters, housed hundreds of women, wives, concubines, servants, and attendants in a complex society that existed solely to serve the shogun's personal needs and produce his heirs. But even here, in what should have been the most private spaces of his life, the shogun found himself trapped by the very system that granted him unlimited authority over others, while denying him agency over his own most basic human relationships. The women of the oku lived in a world within a world, governed by their own elaborate hierarchies and protocols that mirrored and reinforced the larger political system of which they were a part. At the top were the shogun's official wives, chosen not for personal compatibility, but for political advantage. Women whose status derived entirely from their relationship to ultimate power, and whose value was measured not by their individual qualities, but by their family connections and their ability to produce male heirs. Below them were ranks of concubines, selected through processes that resembled diplomatic negotiations more than romantic courtship. Women whose lives became entirely subordinated to the possibility that they might bear the next shogun, and whose worth was calculated in terms of their fertility and their family's political usefulness. For these women, life in the oku represented both extraordinary privilege and crushing limitation, the ultimate expression of how the Tokugawa system elevated certain individuals, while simultaneously destroying their capacity for authentic human relationships. They had access to the finest education available in Japan, the most sophisticated cultural activities, and the most refined aesthetic experiences that wealth and power could provide. They lived surrounded by gardens designed by master artists, wore clothing created by the greatest craftsmen in the nation, and participated in ceremonies of such elaborate beauty that they seemed to transport participants into a realm beyond ordinary human experience. Beneath the wives and concubines were layers upon layers of ladies-in-waiting, servants, and attendants, each with carefully defined roles and strictly limited opportunities for advancement within a system that offered luxury as compensation for freedom. These women lived in luxury beyond the dreams of ordinary people, surrounded by beautiful objects and attended by numerous servants of their own. But they were also prisoners whose lives were entirely circumscribed by the needs and whims of others. Their entire existence became focused on competing for the attention and favor of a man who was himself trapped by the very power that made him desirable, creating a closed system of mutual dependence and mutual imprisonment. But they were also prisoners, confined to the palace grounds, and forbidden from maintaining relationships with the outside world that might compromise their loyalty or provide alternative sources of identity and meaning. Their families might visit occasionally under strict supervision, but for the most part, entrance to the Oku meant permanent separation from everyone they had known before their selection for this honored, but terrible service. Their entire existence became focused on a complex web of relationships within the palace walls, a closed system where personal worth was measured entirely in terms of proximity to power, and success was defined as gaining the favor of someone who was himself isolated from genuine human connection.